So Uncharted 1, I played this game for the first time, I think a little over a decade ago. And when I first played it, I was really into it. I beat it on every difficulty, got all the treasures. I loved this game, wrote a whole review of it on my old blog, where I called it like an unparalleled cinematic experience and stuff like that. And I have to say, going back to it, I do not think it holds up all that well. Now, obviously, some element of this is that my taste has changed. I'm not necessarily impressed or engrossed by the same types of games that I was 10 years ago. But it's also just the fact that so much of what was impressive about the game had to do with the technical achievement of it for the time that it came out. This game came out very early into the PS3's lifespan. It was a huge step up in graphical fidelity. The game was definitely trying to push how impressive its environments looked, how impressive its character models and animations looked. This was a game that was heavily advertising the fact that they had done like full motion acting for the cutscenes. They mocapped actors actually acting on a green screen set and put that into the game. They were emphasizing the story. And I'll say that the biggest strength of this game in my mind is its pacing. It's the fact that the story is well structured. It is fun to watch unfold, and the game is relatively short, so you kind of feel like you're really just acting out little bits and pieces of game in between an engaging, fun little adventure story. But I think, in all honesty, aside from the graphics, which were, while impressive for the time, obviously not impressive now, the game just doesn't do anything exceptionally well. In fact, I think it does a lot of things pretty mediocrely. For instance, people have always memed on the platforming in this game, the fact that it doesn't take any thought or skill. You pretty much just follow the guidelines that are on the walls. You are only ever jumping on an extremely linear path. You don't really need to, time your jumps or anything. I guess you could argue that on the little swinging sections you do, but you really have to the only way you ever fuck up is if you just happen to fuck up really bad. If you're not really paying attention because it's so easy, then you just press the wrong button, or if the game is just being an ass. And this is something that happens often because something about the way that they tracked Nathan Drake's movement, I think just because they tried to make him move realistically, he is therefore forced to always make like complete turns and to try to have his feet, perfectly on whatever ledge he's standing on, things like that. And the result of this is you lack perfect control over him. And sometimes the game doesn't quite figure out what it wants to do with the avatar after you press the button. And so you have these awkward moments where a jump you should have been able to make, you instead fall off a cliff, and then when you respawn, you just do the exact same thing you did the time before, but it works this time. This happens a lot throughout a single playthrough of this game. And it might not be that noticeable if you're not looking out for it because of the fact that the respawns never set you that far back, particularly in platforming segments. So it's not like you're going to really get stuck somewhere. Most likely, you'll have it happen once, and then you'll just respawn and immediately get it right the second time. But when you play through it without that sense of wonder that you might have from a first playthrough, and you know what's going to happen, and you know where you should be able to jump, and you make a leap and it fucks up, it's just infuriating. It immediately is just like, wow, that was not my fault. That is because of this awkward control. And moreover, the game makes no kind of sense with like what ledges you can touch, like where you can go. It always wants you to be on its prescribed path through the level, and deviation is almost immediately punished with death. There are no shortage of times where there seems to be a ledge you should be able to drop onto, but when you drop down, you just die. Drake is able to swim sometimes, but you can't fall into most water in the game. There was one particularly egregious moment when you arrive at the Nazi base towards the end of the game, and Drake jumps out a window, and you grab onto this yellow pipe. Now, you're supposed to switch from that pipe onto another one that's on the right of you that ascends. However, I hadn't noticed this at first, so I instead descended the pipe to the bottom and made what would have been like a 1-foot drop from the pipe to the ground and died instantly as though I had fallen from a great distance. And I thought, that just looks stupid. So all of this stuff, what it does is it breaks immersion. It both breaks the flow of the game when an awkward jump leads to me instantly dying, and it also takes me out of the experience when Drake is, unable to make these very simplistic little falls or jumps. And moreover, it's extremely inconsistent how Drake's jumping actually works, because the game is programmed in such a way as to, have specific reactions in different locations to your button presses. So, if you are, say, facing down a 10-foot gap that Drake is supposed to be able to jump for the narrative, then he can jump that 10-foot gap. But there are other times, if you just press the jump button when you're not at one of those moments, he just limply jumps like a foot in the air or a foot of distance and immediately falls to his death. So there are countless times where you feel like you should be able to make a jump, and then you do it and you just feebly fall down. And then sometimes, if it looks like there was a ledge you should have been able to grab, you're now asking yourself, was this my fault for jumping at the wrong place, or was this the game's fault because sometimes legitimately the jumps just don't work? So you might end up trying the same thing again before coming to a conclusion about it, or, trying to figure something else out. Moments like that they really just show how the basic control scheme of the game isn't all that strong. It feels like what they really wanted to have was this extremely crafted experience, and it just seems like they should have accounted for more ways that the player could behave. I mean, I had a couple of moments where the camera started to sweep around to do one of these epic cinematic shots. And because of the fact that when I walk into a new area in a video game, my instinct is not to rush directly forward into it. I usually would not just continue running forward down a path. I want to stop and look around to make sure that there's not any secrets or things hidden. And this is a game that has secrets. It has these little treasures that are usually just kind of right off the beaten path. Like if you take a sidestep for 1 second, you'll find it. So I'm emerging over this cliffside to where you have the big reveal of the sort of stronghold that you spend your first sort of shootout section of the game. And the camera starts to move, but because I was not running forward and instead had turned to the right to see if there was anything behind the edge of the cave that I had just emerged from, when the camera started moving, I was just like, what the fuck is going on? Like, have I fallen off the cliff? What is happening? And then eventually it finally reached the fully adjusted perspective, and I was like, oh, if I had continued forward, this would have looked epic, but I didn't instinctively do that because that's just not how I play video games. So moments like that just make it feel awkward. It's like something that should have been epic instead looks really goofy and ill-considered. So alright, platforming's not the best, but the platforming doesn't really make up a huge portion of this game. It's really more used to break things up. In fact, I would say that everything in this game is just to have something to do along the course of this story. It's really not a game that's about any one gameplay style, but just about having different things that are moderately fun that, can mix up between them. It's like a grab bag of game design elements that's just designed to propel you through this narrative. So, how is the combat? This is probably the biggest element of the game, and they actually did try to make it at least somewhat challenging. There are shootouts where you will likely die a few times before you get it right, and if you play the game on the higher difficulties, you're going to spend most of your time in the shootouts. Now, the thing is that the enemy AI is simultaneously dog shit and incredible. Because on the one hand, they don't really move around in any kind of sensical way. They just kind of follow a set path that they are, the enemies are just programmed to do a certain thing with the expectation of what position that you will be in. But they also all immediately can see you at all times. The second you've alerted the enemies in the area, everyone is just shooting at you right away. So when you play this on the higher difficulties, the only way to win is to memorize the locations of every single enemy. You will play a shootout over and over again until you know where every enemy spawns in. And a lot of these shootouts are designed in such a way that you're meant to go through them forward, picking off enemies as you go. And then once you get to the other side of the room, enemies start spawning in behind you. And again, you don't really receive warning that enemies are going to spawn in behind you until they start shooting at you. So you just need to know that shit if you're playing on a difficulty mode where you can't take more than one hit. Thankfully, on the lower difficulties, this isn't so much of a problem. But I didn't really mind. I enjoyed sort of playing it as a puzzle-solving routine back when I played this when I was younger. Now, playing it today, I'm just a lot more attuned to the fact that the gunplay feels terrible. Most of the guns handle like ass, have no real impact. The shotguns are some of the worst shotguns I've ever used in a video game. It doesn't really feel like you're firing anything at all. There's some impact when the enemy gets hit, but if you just are firing regularly, it just feels limp and terrible. Most of the handguns suck. The only thing that's really satisfying is just when you blow an enemy away. If you have one of the stronger handguns that kills enemies in one hit, it is satisfying to see the enemies die so easily, but there's almost like a shock feeling to it where you're like, oh, I can't believe that this puny little handgun, in terms of how it feels, had such a big effect on the enemy. There's also the fact that you can only ever carry around one handgun and one larger gun, sort of similar to how Gears of War handled it, except that there's just no creativity with what you can do with the loadout. I mean, when it comes to the handgun, your best bet is to just have whichever one is the strongest. I guess you could say that it's an ammo thing, like you can trade off having, more ammo for more power, but you always want the more powerful one because the weaker guns take like 5 fucking hits to kill an enemy unless you get all headshots, and even then, sometimes the hit detection is just so bullshit. There was one time I shot a guy in the head 6 times before he died. I mean, that's a rare occurrence, but it's something you'll see happen. And it's weird because enemies will sometimes react to being shot in certain places. Like you can shoot an enemy in the leg and kind of slow them down for a second, but it's inconsistent. It doesn't always work, and enemies can take so many fucking bullets and they don't even react because they initiate like a getting hit animation, but if they then start up their next animation right afterwards, they'll just start shooting you before their last one's even really over. It's really kind of confusing. You don't really have a good read on, the information being fed to you is so inconsistent, and it's so often like subtly glitchy that you end up feeling like you just gotta spam ammo, spray and pray on enemies and hope that they die. And the game gives you enough ammo that you can win most shootouts without much of a problem. But on the rare instances that you end up with, like, a little bit of ammo, you end up having to play these gunfights quite tactically, by which I mean, again, memorizing where the enemies are by doing it over and over again, not so much by using raw skill. It's not like the shootout is going to play out wildly differently each time you do it, because again, the enemies are moving on scripted paths. So, moreover, a lot of those paths are just based around assumptions of what you will do in the shootout. They kind of seem to expect you to always be moving from one piece of cover to the next, but that's not always necessary. It's sometimes very easy to just hang back at the first couple pieces of cover in the room and pick off all of the enemies. And then the only reason you move forward is that you need to get more ammo, and then suddenly a bunch of new enemies spawn in, who assumably were supposed to have spawned in like in the course of the fight. It can just be really awkward. It's like you see the mechanism of what's going on way too much. It's like you eventually memorize that, okay, when I step behind this this box, that's when the next wave will spawn in. It's like a little too computery. Again, immersion breaking. I don't even really hate the level design. I think that the shootout galleries are fine. I mean, it's just a bunch of chest-high walls. It's certainly not as well designed as other chest-high wall shooters are. You know, this is no Gears of War, but then Gears of War doesn't have you doing nearly the variety of things that this game does, or have nearly as, you know, well written of characters, I guess. I mean, honestly, and we'll get to the narrative, I guess. The narrative of this game it's, you know, the characters are cheeky, their dialogue is pretty hit or miss, there's not any, like, really funny standout lines, it's just kind of cheeky banter between a couple of characters. Sully is obviously likable just because he's a surly old guy, it's hard not to like him. Drake just is a very boilerplate protagonist, and Elena is just a very boilerplate girl character. You know, they all have ridiculous upper arm strength and get themselves out of any situation just by sheer luck. And, like, what happens in most cutscenes is basically just moving characters around for the next set piece to happen. It's like you'll have a scene where Elena's like, oh, I can grab that ladder, boost me up onto your shoulders, and then she climbs up to another area, and then a bunch of enemies spawn in back where you are, and it's like, okay, so the purpose of this cutscene was just so that they can be separated, so this action scene can play out and make sense. And, like, there's just a lot of cutscenes like that. It's always like, it's like, you know, what makes sense for this next level to play out, or, you know, to get the right combination of characters in the scenes at the right times. I guess the word I'm looking for is convenient, and that's fine on some level. It's an adventure story, but it's just that it's never surprising. And, like, when I think of something like Indiana Jones and how, you know, this is clearly an homage to movies like that, Indiana Jones has moments where you are legitimately taken by surprise by something, that the setups aren't so well telegraphed. You know, when Drake, like, hands Sully the booklet that he got from Sir Francis Drake, like, he hands it to him very dramatically, like, hold on to this, will you? And it's like, ooh, better take note that Sully's taking this book. What? Sully got shot in the chest, exactly where he has a pocket on his shirt? You know, and then, like, not to say that I even know if I necessarily got that my first time through. It's just, like, it's so telegraphed with everything that happens, and, like, when you play through it again, it's just not that rewatchable. It's not the kind of story that really holds up to multiple viewings, because it's pretty uncomplicated and not that interesting. The villains kind of suck. I mean, I think Eddie Raja is funny just because he has a goofy accent and he has the best line in the game. That's right, you ugly kunyuk, don't mess with Eddie Raja. But, you know, the British guy is just an insufferable ponce. I mean, I guess that's kind of part of the point, because then Navarro's, like, the secret villain at the end. That's kind of a nice reveal. I guess that's the one thing, like, it's obviously going to happen, but, like, just the way that Navarro presents it is like, you people are all stupid, like, you don't understand the value of what this thing actually is. I actually know what's going on here. I thought that was kind of fun. But yeah, I think the characters are likable and somewhat magnetic, even though they are all fucking psychotic murderers. But, like, at the very least, you know, you have that, but I just don't think the story is ultimately all that memorable. I mean, it's just a basic adventure story. The characters don't have any arcs. There's no real, like, you know, there's they just kind of are chasing this statue through the whole game, and then at the end, you know, they sink it into the ocean. Twist, there's zombies. Wow. No big deal. You know, it's mostly just a gameplay shakeup. It's not even really that interesting in terms of the story, which I guess is why Uncharted 2 was so much more praised, you know, for having a slightly more complex story, bigger set pieces, more memorable moments. And it's funny because when I played this game when I was younger, I legitimately liked Uncharted 1 more than Uncharted 2 because I wasn't as into the set pieces as I was into just the shooting game. And, like, it's funny for me to go back to it and be like, wow, this sucks as a shooting game. I don't know why I was so into it as a kid, you know? The collectibles suck. Getting the treasures, they're all like pretty lame and generic, and they're in just basic, like they're not hard to find. You pick up most of them just on the course of your way through the game. So I know it sounds like I'm basically just ragging on this game incessantly, and I don't want to do that because I don't think it's a bad game. I think that as a shooting game, if it was just a shooter, it would be a bad shooter game. But if it was just a platform, it would be a bad platform. If it was just a puzzle game, it would be a fucking terrible puzzle game because none of the puzzles require any thought whatsoever. They literally just give you the answers. All of this is just, again, to create a sense of variety and to never have you doing one thing for too long that you would notice that it's not that great. And, like, the environments are pretty interesting, I guess. They're not really that memorable. It's just kind of an island in a jungle. Most of the game is green or brown. It's not going to give you the memorable locales of like a Souls game or something. I guess I kind of remember the church because you go through it twice and there's a big shootout in there. But like, yeah, there's no like set piece moments that are particularly memorable. And then you have shit like the jet ski segment, which is just so badly thought out. I don't know how it even passed into the game. In the jet ski segment, you have to drive a jet ski through an area where enemies are shooting at you and there's explosive barrels. And you can shoot at the enemies and barrels, but you have to stop the jet ski to do it. So all you end up doing is jet skiing forward for like 2 seconds, then shooting some barrels and shooting some guys, and jet skiing for another 2 seconds. You never like pick up speed. It's never exciting because you're always having to stop and pop. It's controls like ass. I don't know how that thing got 3 segments in the game other than just to have something to break up, like a different stylistic shift in the middle, just like the turret section, which is, again, not exciting at all in retrospect. And I generally don't really care for turret sections anyways. So it's like, really, it's just the fact that the game is paced well that makes it, like, sort of pass through you in a very easy kind of way. It's not, you never feel like you're stuck on any one thing for long enough for it to be frustrating, but it's also just challenging enough to be kind of satisfying. So it's like, it's just an unobtrusive experience. It flows right through you, and you get to the end and you go, all right, well, I've taken a little adventure with these characters who are, because of the, pretty good acting in mocap, they come off as like somewhat realistic, I suppose. It's like, I don't know how to I don't know why I enjoy it at all. When I break it down, I feel like I'm describing a bad game, but like, all of it's functional. It's just that it's not great. It's not that it's bad. It's just that there's nothing particularly standout about it other than that it is so easily playable. And like, again, returning to it, it's hard to be impressed by anything because the graphics have not aged that well. All that character animation doesn't look so good anymore. It's a little more uncanny valley than I remember it being from something that, when I played it for the first time, was blowing my fucking mind with how it looked. And I think that was a huge part of the appeal. And it's why, that continued to be part of the appeal for all the Uncharted games. Like, obviously, each one has raised the bar considerably in every aspect. So I don't think it's even weird to think that this game has aged poorly. Like, it's not that nothing I'm criticizing it for was brought up at the time. It's just that at the time, the strengths it had outweighed those for a lot of people. It was like, sure, maybe the gunplay is not that great, but we didn't have 700 other of these types of games to compare it to. And most importantly, we didn't have Tomb Raider, the reboot, because when the Tomb Raider reboot came out, a lot of people criticized it for being a ripoff of Uncharted. And I'll say that while the Tomb Raider games have shitty cutscenes and awful characters and terrible acting, the mechanics feel way better. Lara Croft is way more fun to control. Her jumping is satisfying. The gunplay is not perfect, but it's definitely better than it is in this game, as are the level layouts, the fact that it's an interconnected open world that you can explore and find all kinds of secret dungeons and secret treasures, the fact that it's a lot longer and more in-depth. It's just, even though I don't even like the set pieces in that game at all, playing Tomb Raider and then trying to come back and play Uncharted just really, makes it show, I guess, what are the strengths and weaknesses of these two studios. Naughty Dog, better storytellers, even if I think a lot of the dialogue is groan-worthy and convenient. A lot of it is shit like Nathan Drake saying, Ronan and Navarro couldn't have gone far if they left their lackeys at the gate, and I'm like, why? What does that mean? You're just telling me what I need to know for the plot, even though there's no actual logic to what you're saying. Whatever. This is just fluff dialogue. It's not like it matters, but there's just a lot of that. It's just a lot of characters saying things so the plot can be interpreted and happen. But again, it's a hell of a lot better than Tomb Raider's fucking boring-ass, long-ass cutscenes full of unlikable, trite characters, which are more indicative of the standard of these types of games. So I guess what I'm saying is that Uncharted reached a really high benchmark in a world that didn't have high standards. But the bar has been raised, and it no longer can really, just can't hold up next to that. And that's fine. There's 3 more Uncharted games. I aims to play through them all. So I could, I guess there's more than 3, but you know what I mean. I am Games, signing out.